I'm Denise Howell, and next up on Triangulation, I'm joined by Celia Hodent, author of The Gamer's Brain and Game User Experience Consultant and Expert. Celia was the user experience lead on Fornite, and we're going to discuss how she and her team added things like friction and frustration by design to the game to make it more compelling, how they used neuroscience and cognitive psychology to create gratification, familiarity, challenge, accomplishment, satisfaction, and fun. What is gaming addiction? And do we overuse that term? And when and whether gambling is created by loot crates in games. All this and more next on Triangulation.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Triangulation, episode 395, recorded April 26th, 2019. Celia Hodent, The Gamer's Brain. This episode of Triangulation is brought to you by the Intrazone podcast from Microsoft, your bi-weekly conversation and interview podcast about SharePoint, OneDrive, and related tech within Microsoft 365. Get highlights on usage, adoption, and how SharePoint works for you. Subscribe on your favorite podcatcher today. Hi, folks. I'm Denise Howell, and you're joining us for Triangulation. It's a wonderful day to be joining us because with us is a really fascinating guest today. We're joined by Celia Hodent. Hello, Celia.
Hey everyone. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to talk with you, Celia. We were talking about a bit before the show about the huge impact that you've personally had on my life without even knowing it. And I'm sure that's true of many, many others, as they will realize when they learn that you were the lead of user experience at Fortnite during the development of the game and the launch of the game and the success of the game. You've since left the company, but you have a PhD in psychology and over 10 years of experience in the entertainment industry. You're recognized as a leader in the application of user experience and psychology in video games and in the development of user experience strategy in game studios. You've worked at Ubisoft, LucasArts, and Epic Games, of course, for Fortnite, on many projects across multiple platforms, including Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six franchise, Star Wars 1313, Paragon, and Spyjinx. So it's just a pleasure to have you on the show today, Celia. I can't wait to get into it with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with you and to dive into all these fascinating topics. I love to talk about that. So don't hesitate to stop me if I'm talking too much, because I can talk about this all day.
No. You're on the perfect show. This is our long-form interview show. We go one-on-one. We go deep. I should mention that Celia, in the middle of doing all of her work that I just described, is also an author, and she's told us a lot about how she does the work that she does in her book, The Gamer's Brain, How Neuroscience and User Experience Can Impact Video Game Design. So you are going to want to pick this up and learn even more about what we're going to talk about today. We've picked a perfect day, I learned, listening to my This Day in History app to have this discussion, Celia. This morning, it told me that on this day in 1977, Studio 54 opened its doors for business. And I can't think of a better day to be discussing video game design with the person who integrated dance with video games, I think, in a completely unique way that's never been done before.
Yeah, that's not me. That's the team. But yes.
I'm sure there are neuroscientific reasons why emoting in Fortnite is so compelling. So we can talk about that.
We can definitely talk about it.
All right. So one of the things I wanted to talk about right off the bat is in your book at the beginning, you start out with a chapter on a whole section of the book on understanding the brain. And you talk a lot about myths that we have, misconceptions that we have commonly about how the brain works. Let's hit on a few of those, because I was, as I read through what you have here, it made perfect sense to me, but I realized that I bought into some of these myths for some time. The one you lead off with is the old, we use only 10% of our brains myth. And you're quick to point out, no, that doesn't work. Just sitting here breathing, you're using far more than 10% of your brain.
Yes.
Where do you think we got this misconception?
I don't know. So it used to be a while ago that we had that misconception. Maybe it's because we hope that we can develop our brain and just like be like superhumans or something like that. But recently, so there was that movie from Luc Besson, like Lucy. That's a movie that I don't know, that refreshed that 10% myth. I don't know if you saw it, but Scarlett Johansson, she's trying, like she's getting superpowers, and she's developing her brain, and she's like getting beyond her 10%. And I was like, how can a movie that is like science fiction can use that premise that we know is not true? Like we've been knowing that for a long time. But maybe the reason why we think that way is because of the images that we get from fMRI. I don't know if you've ever seen in magazines where they explain this is the part of the brain that's activated when you read or when you talk or when you do whatever. And you usually see like these little parts in the brain that's lighting up. So that may be reinforcing that idea that only a few parts of the brain is activating when you do a task. But what people don't necessarily know is that these images are done by subtraction. So let's take a simple example. If we want to know what part of the brain is more activated when we read, what we're going to do, we put some people in an fMRI, so to look inside what's going on in the brain, and we ask them to read. And we look at what's activating in the brain, and everything is lit up. And then we ask them to do a control task, such as, I don't know, like looking at a picture, so it's still needing you to watch something, but it's not reading. And then what we do, and it's lining up everywhere in the brain as well. And that what we do, we subtract the first one, the second one from the first one. And what's left is what we believe are the areas of the brain that are more activated when you do a precise task. It doesn't mean that the rest of the brain is silent. The brain is all the time lit up for everything, but maybe because of these images, people have the false impression that only a few parts of the brain are activated at some points in time, which is not true. What is true, though, is that we can develop our capacity. The brain we have brain plasticity. It means that we're not pre-wired. We develop our brain depending on the environment, depending on what we learn. We create new synaptic connections. Let's say you learn how to play the piano. It's creating a lot of new synaptic connections in your brain. So we are developing our brains. But no, the brain is not just using 10% of our resources, because why would you do that? In nature, we don't keep what's not useful. So the brain is the same.
That doesn't seem very evolutionarily helpful for us to use only 10% of our brains. Yes. And the plasticity point that you raised goes to a few of the other myths that you lay out in the book, such as men and women having different kinds of brains, that there are different learning and teaching styles that apply to each individual. And thankfully, as a parent, I'm really glad to learn that although there's a misconception that video games in particular, or technology in particular, are rewiring people's brains, making them function differently than they did in other generations. I guess what your response to that is, well, of course, but so does everything else, right?
Exactly. That's what I just said. Whatever you do with your environment, whatever you train yourself to do, learn, discuss with someone, watch a movie, go to the theater, play video games, all that is gonna change your connections in your brain because your brain is plastic. So yes. But everything has the same impact. So.
Right. And I think it's also really fascinating. You're pointing out that this misconception that we have that, you could be more left-brained or more right-brained, and that gives you certain traits, and that maybe you can work on developing traits on the other quadrant if you're dominant in one, and that it's all one brain.
Yeah, so that's also where people are gonna try to oversimplify what's going on in the brain, and it's I can understand that thing. I that's what I do too. I simplify because the brain is pretty complicated. When I explain how the brain works and what it means for video games, of course I'm gonna simplify a bunch of stuff. But when you oversimplify to the point that it doesn't have any more ground to the reality. And if you do that to sell some stuff saying, hey, I have a new methodology to make your team more right brain, so they're going to be more creative. I mean, that doesn't mean anything. What does it mean to be right brain? I mean, there's not just the right side of your brain that is more creative. It is not true. There are some activities that are going to sometimes lit up some areas more on the right side and sometimes more on the left side, but it doesn't mean that the whole brain is not working at that moment. And we have the corpus callosum, which is like a bunch of nerves where they're communicating with the two hemispheres. The brain is always both sides of the brain is always communicating, and so saying that if you're right brain you're more creative and left brain you're more analytical is completely over-exaggerated, and so it's false. So anybody, usually if it seems too good to be true and too simple to be true, it's not. The brain is super complex, so be careful with anyone trying to sell you anything saying, oh, this is we have like the neuro solution for whatever problem you have. Be very careful because it's usually bullshit.
Right, which is really fascinating because what I took away from your section of your book on that is it's dangerous to generalize and try and have hard and fast rules about something as complex and intricate as the human brain. But at the same time, that's a bit of what you do in applying neuroscience to video games. There are some principles that you've discovered that have to do with how humans experience gratification and satisfaction, and what makes them happy and content, which is what you want to do during a game. So tell me about that seeming conflict there, where we don't want to generalize, but yet we can in some ways.
Yes. So where the danger is when you really oversimplify and you say, oh, I'll take this pill and this is going to be the magic thing to solve your problem. What I do is I'm using all the knowledge that we have in cognitive science, actually. I use the term neuroscience because I have to surf on the hype, but I make amends in the first chapter of my book saying, hey, you know what, folks, we're actually not going to talk about neuroscience because neuroscience is more about, like the chemistry of the brain, and you don't really need to understand that to make games. What I talk about mostly is cognitive science, and we have a lot of studies and research that have been done in the past century about how the mind functions. So cognitive science is about mind processes like perception, attention, memory. We have a very good understanding of these processes in terms of their capacity and limitation. Now, we don't have a good understanding of how the brain works overall and how all these things interact with each other, but we have a good understanding of some elements, and taking one separately from the other, we can anticipate a bunch of things. So in my book, there's two parts. The first part talks about the brain and talks about these mental processes. So I talk about mostly the limitations that we have with our brains, because whenever you design something for people, whether it's a bottle of water or it's a video game, you have to understand what are the physical and mental limitations that we have. Physical, we can understand clearly, more clearly what it means, but mental limitations would be, for example, with perception. Perception is very subjective. We don't perceive the world the way it is. It's not a passive window to the world. So there's the reality, and there's our perception of reality, which means that you might not perceive the same thing that I perceive. And if I'm a game developer and I'm making a bunch of inputs that have to be perceived by players, which is, the basic of video games, you have to make sure that the icons going to use, the character design, the environment design, all that is going to be perceived the way you intended. Same thing with memory. We have a very lousy memory. We don't remember things very well. We have what we call the forgetting curve. We forget a lot of information from one day to the next. And so in a video game, for example, if you teach a lot of things and mechanics and controls to your players, and it's likely that from one day to the next, they're going to forget a bunch of stuff that they learned the day before. So you have to take that into account and make sure that you don't overload the memory. And the last example is attention. We believe we're very good at multitasking and paying attention to a bunch of stuff at the same time, that we're good at scanning the environment, but we actually not good at that at all. Attention is very limited. I don't know if you've ever seen the video whereby you have to count the basketball passes from the team that's dressed in white. Have you ever seen that?
No, I have not.
Oh man, I'm gonna spoil it for you. That's
okay, no, wait. Everybody pause. Go Google this video, find it, watch it. Okay, now you've seen it. Go on, Celia. Yes. What happens in the video?
So in the video, while you're very busy looking and paying attention to the team with the white T-shirt and counting how many basketball passes they make, there's a person with a gorilla suit that's passing by and just like doing a little dance. And most people don't even realize that this is happening. In psychology, we call that the inattentional blindness. We fail to pay attention to things that are surprising when we're focused on something else. We are terrible at that. And if you want to Google, another one is very funny. It's called change blindness. We are very blind to big changes, like, for example, visual changes from one scene to the next, when we don't really pay attention to what's going on. And it can be like changing the color of the paper wall. It could be changing a person as ducking down to, you fill out a little form, and the person is like taking the form and then ducks down to put the form away, and then it's someone else that comes back up. A lot of people don't actually see that there is a change there. We are terrible at paying attention, and when we're busy, like focusing on something, we don't see it. It's hard for us to perceive, and so therefore very hard to process and thus remember information. But right. We believe we're good at that. Especially anyone like the millennial generation, they're not better at that. Either. Women are not better at that. These are all myths. That's the problem, because we don't know. We are blind to our own blindness. We don't realize that these limitations exist. And so if you design a product for someone else to use, you have to take that into account for these people. So I talk about all that, and talk about emotion and motivation. This is more fuzzy because we understand less well how this works, but I give away what we do understand from it, and I give some examples of what we mean for making games and making games more engaging and fun. But I always warn people, be careful. This is not a recipe. These are ingredients that you can use and to make up your own successful recipe for making games, or anything else that you produce that's going to be used by a human and humans interacting with it.
So it seems like part of what you do in applying cognitive science to video game design is perhaps to acknowledge that we're blind to our own blindnesses, but in part to keep us that way by designing things in that make us believe, we are good multitaskers, even though you're giving us hints and clues that help us multitask during the game. Do you agree?
The example I like to use are magicians. Mm-hmm. Magicians know very well the limitations of our brain in terms of perception, attention, memory. They use misdirection of attention to they make you look here and they do something else here and you don't see it. And this is how the magic operates. So this is really what it is. If you want to make some magic happen, and a video game has to be kind of magical because you have to guide players through sometimes very complex games with a lot of systems, and they have to learn a lot of stuff, but you don't want to overwhelm them, but you don't also want to make them feel that they're being tutorialized and they have to do one thing after the other because that's boring. So you have to find the perfect balance to make the magic operate, so you can guide players without them really feeling that they're guided, so they feel that they're figuring stuff out all by themselves. And it's really just like magic when the good magician just makes you feel that something's levitating or that the card has changed and it just looks magic, although you know that there's a trick, but you fail to perceive it.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like gamers are in on the trick, or that they're being tricked somewhat by, or does it vary based on the situation?
It's not. I mean, it's if you use the term being tricked, that it feels like mm-hmm. you're being manipulated in a bad way. But the problem is that people don't necessarily understand that any design is going to influence you to do some things or some other thing. If something as simple as seeing a handle on the door is influencing you to grab this handle and pull the door, and sometimes you actually need to push the door. But the design is influencing you to act in a certain way because you anticipate how certain things are working. And so this is how it works in games. We have to understand the codes and how people are going to understand signs and feedback in the game, so that they're going to be influenced and to do a certain action. And we just want to make sure that they can understand intuitively the design. It's more about it, it's like anything that you're using a software and you're like, oh, this software is horrible. I don't understand anything. It's not intuitive at all. It's the same thing with what we're trying to do with games. We're just trying. It's not about tricking players. It's about making sure that everything's going to feel intuitive, and there's not going to be any frustration for them when they interact with the game that are not by design. There are going to be some frustrations, and there are going to be some challenges because it's a game. So there are usually some challenges in the game, but we don't want to have any friction or frustration that are not by design. And this is what we're talking about. And so when you have good UX, good user experience in a game, you usually don't even realize it's good. You just feels good. You're like, oh, it's a great game. It's when there's something not easy to do and you're struggling to find where's the place where I need to change my character, or where can I craft something? Where do I find this ingredient? I don't know. This is when you feel that I don't get it, and you're when that happens, you're usually mad with the interface, and this is where you can rage quit. It's like, oh, I don't get it. So it's more about making things intuitive and placing the challenge where we want to place it, and not into something that is not by design, where we don't want to place the challenge. Let me give you one example. I don't know if you've heard of the game Monument Valley. It's a very interesting puzzle game on iOS. It's inspired by the art of MC Escher, and it's a game where they are putting the challenge on perception. So you have to play around with perspective to create paths that don't normally exist. So in some games you might want to put the challenge in perception, but in many games this is not where you want to place the challenge. You don't want players to not being sure about how you how to interpret an icon, or if their perception is tricked. Most of the time, you want players to understand the icons, understand like seeing a character design and understand what sort of character is this. Is it an enemy? If it's an enemy, how is it going to be dangerous? So most of the time, this is not on perception that would a challenge. So this is what it's about. It's identifying where the problems are going to be, so we can remove all the frictions that are not by design, so that players can just have fun and learn about these complex games, the mechanics, the systems, the storyline, the controls, in a way that it feels fluid and intuitive, rather than being painful and hard to do.
Right. Just like in the real world. Yes, it makes perfect sense. Just like in the real world, if you walk up to a door that it appears that you push, but you have to pull it instead, that's frustrating.
Exactly. Super annoying.
Yeah. So this seems like a great opportunity to talk more about Fortnite in detail and how you applied some of those principles there. We mentioned dancing before, and I love how you phrased this: friction and frustration by design, because I guess we could really take a 10,000 foot view here and try and decide, what it is people are trying to get out of video games, why they play them in the first place, what role they play in our lives and society. And if the answer to that is it makes you feel good and you feel satisfied and you feel happy and you feel content and you feel fulfilled, then you wouldn't want frustration at all, right? But it turns out that overcoming challenges and experiencing surprise and to some extent violence all have those kinds of results for a player once they've worked through a scenario. Let's talk about the violence piece for a second, because again, as a parent, I'm thrilled to see more and more games that seem to downplay the really blood and guts aspect of video games. Fortnite is one of them. It's rated T. When you kill something in Fortnite, there's a little, explosion of sorts that indicates that something has happened, but there isn't a lot of blood, or really any blood or guts in the game, and that didn't seem to slow it down at all. Can you talk to that for a moment?
Sure. So I'm not aware of any research that says that violence is compelling, and that's what makes people engage in video games. Mm-hmm. What we know is that if you want to be engaged in an activity, there's two main things. If motivation is what is creating behavior. If you're not motivated into going to work for whatever reason, you're not going. There's a lot of different types of motivation, but again, for the sake of simplification, there's two types that we talk a lot. It's extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is you have a goal and you're going to get a reward, and it's a means to an end. You do an activity, you do a quest because you are interested in that reward, because that reward is going to make you able to do something else. So that's extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is when you do an activity just for the sake of doing it. And we know that the most reliable theory of intrinsic motivation that we have so far is called the self-determination theory, or SDT for short. And it explains that we are more motivated to do certain activities when these activities satisfy our needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Competence is about progressing. So when you talk about challenge, games where there's a big emphasis on challenge, this is mainly touching competence. So to feel competent, you need to see that you're progressing. And if you, at some point there's a difficult challenge, but you see that, okay, I'm gonna do it, and you try 1, 2, 3 times, and at some point you overcome that challenge, you see that you're progressing, and it feels very good. autonomy is about self-expression, being able to change how you look like, choose the dance moves that are the most representative of who you are or what you want to convey, or meaningful choices. So it could be that's the reason why sandbox games are very successful. These are the games like GTA or Red Dead Redemption or Assassin's Creed. These games where you have like a big world and you have a lot of different things that you can do, and you can solve problems in different ways. So that's good for autonomy. You can choose. It's meaningful choice that you can make in the games. And the last one is relatedness. So that's the reason why also online games are very popular, because we can play with each other. We're a very social species, so we can collaborate and compete. And oftentimes we collaborate with a squad and we compete with other people. So we know that. Yeah,
that became extremely important for Fortnite.
For any game, it's important. But yeah, we can go back into that aspect for Fortnite. But for any game, it's going to be important to have that dimension, and that's the reason why most of the time online games are more successful than solo games. I mean, there are exceptions, but that's because it's adding that layer that we care about as humans. So all that detour to tell you that we don't have any data saying that violence is compelling or making us more engaged. Now, like any entertainment form or art form, you have elements that are more kid-friendly, and you have some that are portray violence. So that's more about your mood at the moment, or if you want to tackle something that might be distressful, and that's the reason why. So I'm not saying that kids should play violent games, but kids, when they grow up, they need to have little scary stories, or by having these little stories, they try to master their fear. So they usually, that's the kids' stories are easier to handle for them, and they repeat them after again and again and again, or they're going to portray using dolls what's happening that might be scary for them, because they need to master it. So sometimes as adults, that's a reason why we sometimes like to play violent games, because we see the violence in real life, and it could be that it's helping us to handle it in an environment that is secure, like a video game.
Yeah. I took an English class at UCLA from Bruno Bettelheim. Are you familiar with his work?
Yes, a little bit.
Yes.
I'm not super familiar with that, but I know.
Yes, but so he was a child psychologist who taught a children's literature class when I was at UCLA, and you're discussing exactly what our class was about the dark side of fairy tales and children's stories.
About that, of course. So that might be the reason why some adult games are portraying violence a lot. And also because at some point where games became 3D, so, a long time ago, games were not super violent, or it was not. It was just 2D, and you could not see a lot of things. And it's when the technology was getting better, this is where it was more easy to have games in first person. And so first-person shooters, this is when it exploded. And of course, when you're a first-person shooter, you think about games that portraying violence and wars and stuff like that. But now we went through that phase, and games before were not necessarily violent, and we had that phase, like peak of violence, and maybe now we have a more, let's say, balanced, hopefully, offer in terms of video games, where you have, you're still going to have violent games that are more for adults, and then you have a lot of different games for everybody. And that's the thing that I love about games today, is that we are getting more and more diversity in the characters that are portrayed in games, which is also something that I found that really great in Fortnite. And in my opinion, this also helped a lot its success because you have, when you play Fortnite, the Battle Royale, the first time you play, you don't choose your character, and it can be a black character, it can be a white character, it can be a girl, it can be a guy. You can have like a lot of different styles and clothing. So it's portraying a lot of diversity, and so everyone can relate, find a character to relate with them, and that's the really cool part about game. So it's getting more diverse in many ways. I'm just hoping it's going to get more diverse with the people making games. Still have to work on that, but hopefully we're getting there.
Right. I'm glad you brought up diversity in the game. It seems like women in Fortnite are about the best. Well, again, I'm not a gamer, so there are probably tons of other good examples of positive portrayals of women characters in games. But looking over my kid's shoulder, watching him play Fortnite, I've been very impressed by how women are portrayed in the game. And it seems like not only a positive step forward for the industry, but that it's useful for the game. Do you agree?
And they're equal. They're equal with the guys portraying the game as just a skin, as just cosmetic. So that's good. And you have sometimes sexy characters and sometimes less sexy characters, and that's all fine. So I love that diversity, and I hope we getting I hope we're arriving at the moment where we're going to have that sort of diversity with every game.
Yeah, let's hope so. Let's see if there's anything else about the game itself. Well, we didn't talk specifically about dancing and the fun that you have in Fortnite. There's a lot of humor and fun in the game. Tell us about the cognitive psychological rationale for that.
Yeah, well, this is when I don't want to oversimplify everything. But so there's a few elements here. The dance moves relates to autonomy. So autonomy is important for intrinsic motivation. And when you have a lot of different dance moves, it's funny. You can choose the one you prefer. And then the cool things with dance moves is you can also reproduce them in real life. So then it's allowing to have a culture. And so if you're going at school and you do a specific dance move to your classmates, then they're going to recognize that dance move. So it's bringing some relatedness. So again, another important element for intrinsic motivation outside of the game. And so now you have a culture. Now I recognize you because, you're doing a dance move that's from Fortnite. I recognize that move. And then all of a sudden you bring the game outside of its universe at school, and people just do the dance moves. So that's the reason why the dance moves are really important, because they bring autonomy. And also it creates like a common culture around the game. And so I can relate to my teammates even outside of the game. So that's the main elements about the dance moves. And it's good because it makes kids move, and that's also very important.
Definitely. So it seems like there's the side where you want to create a common culture around the game, but the game wants to reflect culture outside the game as well. As a lawyer, in the technology arena, I've paid attention over the years to remix culture and of course the intellectual property ramifications of that. Fortnite has been sort of humorously, yet legitimately in some cases in the crosshairs of people who have said, hey, what's that thing I did doing in the game? And then, you have to leave it to IP law to figure out if it's a proper use or not. Is that something that maybe you could just speak to that for a moment, how you balance incorporating things from outside the game within the game?
So I'm not a lawyer.
Right.
Usually, if we ever want to do that, I would go to the legal team and ask, what's okay, not okay. It's complex. It's important to bring something from the outside to the game, especially when you have that cultural phenomenon around a game, because you want it to be relevant with your real life. So if you want people to relate to something, you're gonna use dance moves from today. Maybe you're gonna use some dance moves from yesterday because it's also funny. But the way people dress in Fortnite, and all that is gonna matter, because if kids listen to certain music and go watch certain movies, or look at certain artists that do certain moves, if they see it in the game, then they're like, oh yeah, that game is about me. And that's again the reason why diversity is very important, in terms of everything, culture, representation, and pretty much everything for all ages, because then people can say, oh yeah, this game recognizes that I exist as part of a culture, because my culture, my references are expressed in the game. But yes, then you have the problem that what's allowed and not allowed. That's a very interesting question, and I would leave the legal team to take care of that, because it is pretty complex, and there's no precedent for what I know in terms of dance moves used like that.
Right, and I guess the other aspect where intellectual property comes up sort of famously in the headlines with respect to Fortnite is the Battle Royale mode, which it adopted from other games that also had used that mode. And not to say that anybody has the rights to that or not, but it's another example of how borrowing from what's out there can make a game really take off. And it seems like when Fortnite shifted from offering only Save the World to offering Battle Royale, I mean, that is when I had a house full of teenagers screaming, shrieking, making noises I've never heard of before, because they were having so much fun playing the Battle Royale mode of Fortnite.
So So we have to be careful, because there's a lot of factors that are happening at the same time, and we have a lot of biases on top of the kind of limitations. One of these biases is called the hindsight bias. After the facts, when we look back at what's happening, it's always easier to do, oh, it was this that made it work, or it was that. So we have to be careful. With that, Fortnite was already quite successful before Battle Royale, in the sense where it was a paid game, and after a few weeks, Fortnite announced on Twitter that we had like 1 million players. So that was for a paid game. When Battle Royale arrived, it was a kind of a new mode. It was not that new, because it was already a mode that was experimented for a few years, but it was getting traction at that moment. That mode became free on Fortnite, and then you had a lot of personalities like Drake that started playing the game. So all that created like a huge mega boom kind of impact. So it's hard to determine what's important. What was the most impactful one? But of course, when a game is free, it's removing a lot of barriers for everyone. Battle Royale, it's a mode. It's hard. There's no copyrights for gameplay and for game design, and you have a lot of the similar modes in multiplayer. Like, for example, you have capture the flag mode, or this is when you have a team that's trying to capture the flag of the other team. So it's a mode. So it's hard to say, who started that mode, and can we copyright it? So far, it's not the case. So that's how you end up with a lot of games that have the same sort of gameplay, like the match, what we call the match 3 games, when you have to match 3 candies or 3 patterns, and you have a lot of games that use that same gameplay. So this is something that maybe we can look into, but we can't copyright, we can protect a game design or gameplay so far.
The other really interesting choice with the Battle Royale mode in Fortnite is the decision to limit it to, I forget exactly how long each match is. Is it 15 minutes, something like that?
Well, you have the map that's reducing in size, so it's forcing everybody to be in the same area. So it's limited in that way, but it can still. It's the game. The mode ends. The match ends when there's only one person standing or one group standing. So it can happen fast or really at the last minutes of the game. But yeah, it's pretty fast. I don't remember, but it's less than 20 minutes maybe. I don't know.
I can tell you that parents of Fortniters all over the world got really used to hearing just 10 more minutes or just 15 more minutes, and then they were done, which was again pretty welcome too, until they launched in again.
That's the thing that for parents they need to understand when they want to, because you have to refrain kids from playing at some point, because kids don't self-control well. Adults have a hard time with that too, but kids, they're really not good at self-control. If they start eating something they like sweets, they're gonna eat the whole thing and not having a proper dinner. So it's the same thing with video games. If they like to play a game, they're gonna just play that game and not do anything else. So I know it's hard on parents to have to police that, because parents are super busy. Sometimes they have several jobs, and they come home, they have to do laundry and dishes and prepare food. So I get it, it's hard, but at some point you have to limit kids and say, well, now you stop playing. But if you want to do that effectively, you have to take into account two main things. First of all, the game has some moments of natural stops. So if you try to stop your kid from playing when they're right in the middle of the battle and maybe they're gonna win, it's super frustrating for kids if they have, if you interrupt their gameplay at that moment, and it's going to be very hard for them to overcome that feeling, because again, kids have a hard time dealing with frustration, and adults too, but for kids it's even harder. So you have to look at what they're playing, maybe play a few games with them to understand a bit better what this game is about, so you can make a deal with them, like, okay, you play one or two more matches, and maybe this match you died very early, you lost very early because you don't really die in Fortnite. So if you lose in the first minutes, then okay, try another game so that you don't feel bad about yourself and you don't want to end on a loss. So that's one thing, knowing at what moment, what was going to be more easier for the child to deal with the frustration from when they have to stop. And the second thing is you have to also keep in mind that they don't play alone in this virtual universe. They're playing with their friends. So it's just like when kids are going, to beach and they're playing with all their friends. And if you say, well, now it's over, like come back home, and the other friends are still playing, well, it's very difficult for the kids, because now they're not allowed to stay with their friends. So it's not just the aspect, their relationship to the game. It's also it's in the game. It's a social environment where they interact with other friends. So if you want that to be more effective, if usually they play. It's not always the case, but a lot of kids, they play with their real life friends, like at school. So if you know who they're playing with, you can call up the parents, and you can decide together, all right, we're going to let all our kids play together on Saturday from 2 to 3 or whatever, so that everybody stops at the same time, so it feels less frustrating. So that's the two aspects to understand the challenge aspect. And there's more natural moments to be able to stop playing, and the social aspect.
Yeah, excellent tips there for all the gamer parents who might be listening. And I'm wondering too, if just that brevity of each round of the Battle Royale experience is it's not just good for the parents who need that logical point to wrap things up and be able to call it quits, but I assume that there's a cognitive user experience reason behind that it's gratifying to be able to go in, have this intensive experience, and then wrap it up in 15 minutes.
Yeah, so that's more to do. It's hard to tell, because when you're really passionate into doing something, whether it's watching a movie or play a board game, there are some board games that last very long. Or if you ever play Dungeons and Dragons, these are campaigns that you play like for hours with your friends. Or if you go see a movie, it's sometimes 2 hours long. But it's easier for us to stay focused on shorter batches. So as an adult, if you stay focused on the same activity for more than 40-45 minutes, this is where it's getting harder to concentrate. You need a break. That's also something people need to know, especially like all the bosses in the world need to understand that breaks are good, because if you do like a 5-minute break, when you come back, you're way more efficient, because you can refocus on your task and keep going. So whenever you feel that it's getting harder, that you have a hard time concentrating, it means that you need to take a break. So if you have and for kids, the younger they are, the harder it is for them to concentrate for a long time. So if you have rounds that are about 20 minutes, it's easier to focus on the gameplay for 20 minutes, and then whatever the outcome, then you can take a break and refocus on another match. So having shorter bursts of moments when you have to concentrate, and because it's a game where you have to take into account a lot of information. It's pretty draining in terms of attentional resources, what we call the working memory, because you have to pay attention to the environment, to what the others are doing. You have to coordinate with your friends. You have to make up your strategy and your tactics. All that is consuming a lot of energy for the brain. And so the more it lasts, the harder it is to keep the distance. So 20 minutes is it's a good timing. Look at TED Talks. They're about 20 minutes. It's also because of that. It's easier to focus on the topic for 20 minutes. Beyond that, it might be more difficult to stay concentrated unless you're super motivated and you're into what we call the flow. This is when you don't even realize that time is passing, that you need to go to the restroom or you're hungry, because you're really absorbed by your task, whether it is you're creating something, you're painting, or you're crunching numbers, or whatever it is that you do that you care about, and that requires some effort.
Well, we are definitely in the flow of our conversation here, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it.
So.
But I do need to take a quick break, taking your advice that breaks are good, to thank our sponsor for this episode of Triangulation, which is the Intrazone. The Intrazone is a podcast from Microsoft, and it is your bi-weekly conversation and interview podcast about SharePoint, OneDrive, and related technology within Microsoft 365. You're going to get the most out of SharePoint and learn how it works for you if you listen to the Intrazone. Each episode covers important topics and information about Microsoft SharePoint, including news and announcements, a focused topic of the week, a guest perspective section where you hear from various experts, users, partners, and customers, a partner highlight where they'll feature a partner from the strong ecosystem, frequently asked questions in a roundtable format, upcoming events, conferences, and workshops. You'll learn how to more easily manage and share your content and empower teamwork throughout your organization with the technology you already have. And if you're on the fence about attending the SharePoint conference on May 21st through 23rd, now you can save $50 off the registration. Go to aka.ms/SPC to register and use the code CASHMAN, all uppercase. That's KASHMAN. Subscribe to the Intrazone wherever you listen to your podcasts. Subscribe to the Intrazone today. That's the Intrazone, INTRAZONE. Thanks so much to the Intrazone for your support of Triangulation. And now we're back talking with Celia Hodent, author of The Gamer's Brain, former lead of user experience for Fornite. And Celia, I wanted to turn the discussion at this point to the ethics piece of user experience and applying your in-depth psychological and cognitive knowledge to, well, we used the term manipulate earlier in the show, so I'll use it again, manipulate people's reactions to the games that they are playing. You were talking a moment ago about kids and addiction, and really anybody can get addicted to a video game, but it's a definite.
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that.
Okay, well, we should talk about that. But it's certainly more fraught for children. And the thing that the term that I keep coming back to as I consider what you do and its role in creating games is social engineering. That there is an aspect of people being maneuvered and steered to undertake certain behaviors, whether it's opening a door or opening a loot crate, which is something that has been more problematic for regulators in recent years. But before we start talking about gambling and loot crates and stuff, let's talk about the addiction piece. Why don't you think people can get addicted to games?
Because they can't. It's not what we see. So we have a tendency to use lightly some terms like addiction. Addiction is describing a disorder that is very precise. You have very very precise criteria to match to be considered addicted to an activity without a substance, like addiction to a video game. You have to have at least 5 symptoms over the year, and symptoms like you can't stop, you're gonna lie to your family about how much you're engaged in a game, it's gonna impact your social life, you can stop caring about other activities that you did care about before. So it's pretty heavy. And there was a study conducted by Andrew Shabilsky and Amy Orban that identified that less than 1% of players, and it was a bunch of countries, I think it was North America, Germany, and UK, if I remember well, less than 1% of players could be considered addicted to video games. So it's really not common, and it's a problem to me that we throw that word all the time lightly, because addiction is a problem. People suffer from it. It's usually people who have anxiety or depression, and they find solace into an activity like can be sports, or it can be gambling, or it can be video games. So it is a problem. These people are suffering and they need help. So when we throw the term addiction, just to talk about people that are super engaged in an activity, it's doing a disservice to the people who actually suffer from this disorder, and it's stigmatizing billions of gamers that actually are not addicted. So that's the reason why I don't like that we use that term, just to say that you have moments that kids that are, or adults that are super engaged with an activity. Sometimes it's going to be like watching Game of Thrones. Sometimes it's going to be playing Fortnite. Sometimes it's going to be like going to the gym. Sometimes it's going to be like whatever it is, like watching House of Cards, or whatever it is that you feel like super engaged with at some point. So it happens to all of us at some point, and we just have to really understand that. And this is also something that I don't like. And some of us in the game industry, we're going to describe some of our games as being addictive, as if it was a good thing.
A positive thing, yeah.
Yes, it's not positive. It's a problem. So we should describe our games if they're fun. We can say it's an engaging and immersive and fun game. But if you use the term addictive, it's a problem. So we have a tendency to use that term, and because there is a real problem that exists that we need to help people who are addicted, now all of a sudden we believe that video games can create addiction, and it's a danger to just start playing game, which is not what we're seeing so far. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done. But you can see like less than 1% of players, when we are billions of players that are truly addicted. It's a very small percentage.
So I appreciate the semantic clarification. That yes, you make an excellent point, but I am interested in the 1% and the fact that if the kinds of methods that you employ continue to be refined and become even more powerful and effective, that 1% may become bigger than 1%. And certainly, I as a parent of younger video game age children and constantly exposed to them and their friends, I can tell you that I've met some of the 1%, and I've seen some of the 1% have to go to programs to extract them from the 1%, hopefully, and that it is a problem. And as you point out, it's more of a problem for younger folks, and it's necessary for their parents to intervene and make sure that they're minimizing that. But I do wonder, since we're talking about the ethics piece of this, if you think there should be a line drawn as to the social engineering aspect of making a game super compelling and hard to leave.
Sure. So that's a different aspect. It's the engagement part with the game, which is not to say that it's creating addiction. Like again, the people are getting addicted to the game are usually people who suffer from depression or anxiety, and they find solace in the game. So it's not that the game creating that addiction is there, finding refuge in there. So that being said, we do have mechanics that are rewarding engagement, and this is more aligned with the problem with the attention economy, just like Tristan Harris talks about. So I don't know if you have heard of Tristan Harris as an ethicist, as ex-Googler. And now he talks about how some mechanics in the tech industry is making us stay on the platforms. So if you look at, for example, YouTube, when you watch a video, then you have the next video is going to autoplay in the next few seconds. So you actually have to interrupt the video if you don't want to stay on the platform. And so once one of these people are doing that, so YouTube starts, and now all of a sudden, like Facebook has to do it. They have to autoplay videos, and then Netflix is going to do it. So you stay on the platform as long as possible. So in the same aspect in video games, especially when you have a free-to-play game, because you have to understand that a lot of studios are struggling. So we always talk about the big examples like Fornite and those who make like billions of dollars or millions of dollars, but most of the game industry is struggling, and making games is very hard. The free-to-play business model is a very harsh model. It relies on people who are going to stay on your game. That's what we call retention. So we need players to retain, so that at some point maybe they're going to be enticed to buy something in the game so that you can make money. And it's so hard that even like big studios like Telltale, that was making The Walking Dead, had to close, and everybody was fired. So it's very difficult. It's a very difficult industry, and especially if you're making free-to-play games. And because of that, there's some mechanics that is encouraging retention, is encouraging players, encouraging you to come back every day. It's encouraging you to keep playing. And so there's some what we call, so that's the thing. There's you call that social engineering. I prefer to use the term from Richard Fass from the book Nudge. He's explaining how the environment is manipulating us in sometimes good ways and sometimes bad ways. He talks about choice architecture. As designers or as people that are designing any environment, you are an architect of choice for the people who are going to interact with that environment. And so if you're telling to players, you need to level up, and your friends are going to keep playing, and they're going to level up. So if you stop playing, you're going to stop leveling up. And when you're going to come back, you're going to be lower in terms of level than your friends. This is triggering what we call the fear of missing out, which is something that we can all feel every now and then. For kids, again, it's harder to master and to take control of. And so if the game is not at some point encouraging breaks, or at least it's not punishing disengagement, this is when we can have that problem. And now
Right.
it's a big problem, because I understand why game developers do that, because if they don't do it, another game is doing it, and people are going to go play to the other game and not play on their game, and they might not, make the money they need to survive. So it's not, it's not being evil. It's not just for make more billions or whatever it is. Most of the time, it's about surviving as a game developer. So it's more for the studios who are having like a great success to think about how they can reward breaks, or at least not punish when you don't play. And some games already do that. If you look at World of Warcraft, which is a very successful game that's based on subscription. So it's not a free-to-play game. Now it's kind of free-to-play, but anyway, it started as a subscription. So they still need players to keep playing if they want to make money out of it. And what they did is when you play the game, you do missions, you interact with the environment. All that is bringing you experience points, and when you have experience points, you level up. The more you level up, the more you're powerful, etc. At some point in the game, if you want to take a break, you stop playing. When you come back, what's going to happen is your experience point bar is turning blue, and for a certain period of time, depending on how long you stayed away from the game, you gain, I don't know exactly what's the percentage, but let's say you gain twice as fast experience points for the time that you were away from for the game. So thanks to that, you don't feel punished for taking a break, and you can easily catch up to your friends if they played longer than you did. So it's things like that, these mechanics. Or if you look at Animal Crossing, which is a game also played with a lot of kids, at some point there's nothing left to do in the game, and so it's encouraging to stop, because you've done all the tasks that you had to do, and just have to wait until there's something more to do. So we need to think about that, and how we can, stop punishing disengagement, so we have less of that problem of the attention economy. So it's more about these elements. This is way more subtle than saying is getting kids addicted. And that's my problem also with that, is because we're using like fear mongering, and like parents, they don't know what to do, and it's diverting and like distracting us from talking about the precise and subtle elements that we need to talk about.
Absolutely. And it's good that you're paying attention to these topics and discussing it within the industry, because I think lawmakers are starting to pay more and more attention to technology in general, and the video game industry has always been in their sights on the violence front. And I think now, the compulsion to play part is high on their list. And I think this is a little far afield from what we're talking about, but there's a pending piece of legislation now that's called the Detour Act. It was introduced by Senators Mark Warner and Deb Fischer, and it relates to something called dark patterns, which are, you were talking about leading you on to through the interface to do something that perhaps, they want you to do, but maybe if you were not being so led by the interface, you would make a different choice. And it's aimed at companies with over 100 million monthly active users that are using interface sort of tricks and tweaks to get people to hand over personal data. So I don't know that it necessarily applies here, because what you're handing over in the game is your attention and your engagement. But I could see it not being a huge leap for lawmakers to say, hey, if they're using known cognitive manipulations to engage users further and lead them down this path, that would be problematic. So it's good that the industry tries to get out in front of that and not invite regulation of it.
Yes, but dark patterns, they've been existing for a while, and they were introduced more by marketing, and it's because the business model has changed in video games that now they're introducing this sort of dark patterns in the games. It's more tied to monetization. The engagement part is more about the mechanics that we're talking about. It's all about what you reward and what you punish, or what you don't reward. Dark patterns are often more geared towards monetization, and it's something that's been around for a while. If you ever bought something that you really did not need for during Black Friday, you fell for a dark pattern. And it's been around for a while, and I believe it is a problem, because you don't realize that you're paying something more expensively because you were enticed to believe that it was a good deal, where it's not a good deal. We are not good at making rational decisions. We always compare to a prior situation to make our decisions, and so depending on how a situation is framed, it's going to encourage you to buy something rather than something else. So if we have time, I can give you a few examples of that. But that's the problem with dark patterns, and it's when people are doing things that are not for their best interest, knowingly swayed by the environment. Just like if you had to tick a very simple example, you had to tick an option to not get a newsletter whenever you're buying something. That's a sort of dark pattern, because most people are not going to look at the little elements and small. And if you have to tick to not get the newsletter, we call that an opt out. You have to do something to opt out, as opposed to you can opt in. So you have an option to sign into the newsletter, but you have to do something to get in. We know that it's a sort of dark pattern, because then you're going to end up getting the newsletter when you really did not want to have it, and you just because you didn't pay attention, and we know our attention is limited, we tricked you into doing that. So that's a very simple example. But there's a more complex examples that we can use, and it's a dark pattern when it's to the company's benefit, and there's no real benefit for you. It's contrary to what you wanted to do. It's considered a nudge when it's actually for your benefit or for the greater good benefits, such as you have countries where you have to opt out if you don't want to participate into organ donation after you died. Like here in the U.S., if you go do your driver license and DMV, you have to tick if you want to opt in. And many countries in Europe, you have to tick if you want to opt out. But they do that consciously because it is increasing organ donation and saving lives. So it is also a sort of manipulation, but in that case, we call that a nudge, because we know that most people don't really have an opinion, so might as well make sure that some lives are saved. So it can be considered some being paternalizing to people, and we can discuss these things. But this is where it's complicated, because it's not the design itself that makes it a dark pattern. It's the intention behind it, and determining if the intention is a win-win situation or for the greater good or just for the benefit of the company can sometimes be a bit blurry. So that's why we need to talk about ethics and to decide where we want to draw the line. So all these discussions are really important, but if there's any regulations that come in place, that's going to be very difficult to define where is the line.
Absolutely. And it seems like that's a great backdrop against which to discuss loot boxes and the fact that in Europe and here in the US, there have been efforts to regulate them and to characterize them as gambling. I know you've spoken on that and have some thoughts on how we can draw that line. Can you share those with us?
Sure. And again, I have to explain a bunch of stuff because it's a dark, it's a gray area. It's not black or white. So gambling and loot boxes are a form of what we call intermittent rewards with a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. It means that in behaviorism, like the Skinner box with the little rat, when the rat had to press a lever to get a pellet of food, well, sometimes the rat would press the lever, would not get any food, and sometimes would press the lever, would get some food. So it would be variable. The rat did not know when it would get the food. When it's variable, we know that it's actually more engaging. This is where we see the highest and steadiest response rate. It means that we have a tendency to press the lever because maybe we're going to get the pellet and we don't know when it's going to happen. So it's something is more engaging, and this is the mechanic that we have in gambling. For example, you press the lever and you don't know, maybe you're going to have like 777 or whatever pattern. Like now there's a lot of different game designs in gambling. Maybe you're going to win a lot of money and maybe you're just going to lose everything or win a little bit. So it's the same principle. But it's the same principle if you play a game, whatever board game, and you have to throw dice, because it's a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. Sometimes you're going to have like a very small number. You make, like have 3, and sometimes you have double 6s. So it's also more engaging because when you have double 6s, you're like, yeah, make a good score. And so you feel super powerful. So this is very engaging and by itself, and it's not a bad thing by itself, because it's in many games you experience that. In a lot of games we have what we call RNG, which is random number generator. Which is, for example, if you kill an enemy in a game, sometimes you're going to have the loot from it. Sometimes it's something crappy or you don't have anything, and sometimes you have something super valuable for inside within the universe of the game. RNG is also a form of variable ratio reinforcement schedule. It's more exciting when you don't know. Sometimes you're going to hit an enemy of people who are playing a lot of D&D. We had that also in tabletop D&D. Sometimes you're going to make a very good score with your dice and you have a critical hit. So that's also the same sort of things. When we talk about gambling, it's a sort of a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, but it's tied to money. So you have to pay to participate, and what you can gain is valuable in real life, and it's usually about money. When we talk about gambling, it's you put money in and you can get money out. So in games, when you have loot boxes are chests or card packs that you can buy, and you open them, and sometimes you have some stuff that are not super interesting. Sometimes you have something super rare from within the environment of the game. So the big difference is, yes, you pay some money to get it, but it's a bit diluted because you don't pay directly with your credit card with cash, because you have the what we call hard currency in the game. So you have a currency, like in Fornite, it would be the V-Bucks. In a lot of games, it would be coins or gems or whatever. This is what you use to buy loot boxes in a game. So it's diluted. You don't pay it directly. And usually you can gain this currency just by playing the game. So you don't necessarily have to pay real money to buy loot boxes. So that's one big difference. And the second big difference is, well, usually it's just valuable inside the game. You don't gain real life value out of it. Except that, so like if we just take that example, it's not very different from trading cards that a lot of kids of my age or your generation played. And it's the same principle. It's also a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. You buy a pack of cards, you don't know what you're going to get, and then you're going to trade the cards. So there's a few differences here. First of all, in a digital environment, you don't have all these barriers that you would have when a kid wants to buy trading cards. Back in the day, the kid would need like cash, and so would have to ask their parents, "Hey, can I buy the trading cards?" or use their own money. So it's actually harder to do that. And either you have your pocket money and you can spend it, but you know that this is all the pocket money that you have, so it's easier to see the value of it, or you have to ask your parents, and parents might not be agreeing, and blah, blah, blah. So you have a lot of steps that's actually helping kids dealing with their difficulty with self-control. It's the environment that is blocking them to actually buy it right away. In the case of games, if the credit card is already entered and you just have to click on a button to get a bunch of coins, and with these coins then you're going to be able to buy some loot boxes. It's harder. There's more distance between the real cash in the real world and the what you spend in the game. So it's harder to keep track of what you're doing, and it's more immediate. You can just do it with a click. So that's the first difference. And the second thing is that so some games have some how do you call that? A marketplace, whereby you can sell or trade the stuff that you gained in loot boxes. So this is when it's starting to, because you can sell the items that you got in the loot box, which you can pay with real money. So this can really be considered as gambling when you have that marketplace, when you can sell or trade these items that you gain in loot boxes. But that being said, at the end of the day, the real life value is all about perception. What if you value a lot a rare item that you got, and because it's part of a virtual world, which is meaningful to you because this is where your friends are, this is where you spend a lot of time, and so where's the line there? Where can we decide that is it real life value or not, because it's virtual? So as long as, to me, as long as you can buy it with real money, even through the different steps, because you buy a hard currency, you don't buy it directly. To me, it could be considered as gambling, and it can be difficult because people, they're excited about the real value they can get out of it, and they have to most of the time pay money for it. And again, kids and teenagers, they're pretty bad at self-control. This is something that's developing maturing pretty late in the brain. So it's way harder for them than it is for us. And even for us, sometimes we gamble. If you go to Las Vegas, you're gonna sometimes go over your budget because you're just excited about it. But for kids, it's a bit harder to stop. So I would agree that whenever you have, again, a game that is rated T or E for everyone, loot boxes can be a problem because of the young population. So I hope that makes sense. It was a long explanation, but it is pretty precise. That's why I wanted to explain it precisely.
And I'm glad you did. I'm skeptical that lawmakers and regulators will have the patience to get into the weeds in that way. I hope that they do, because it's an important issue. Yes.
Science is important because everything is in the gray area. So if you want to have a regulation that's fair and just, you have to understand all these elements.
That's right. Someone in our IRC is pointing out a shift in Fortnite with the loot llamas, making them transparent so that you can see what you get before buying. Was that in response to these kinds of concerns?
I don't know. I was out of Epic back then, but I'm guessing they're, because again, when we create games, we don't necessarily realize what's going on, and we just want to make the best game, and we want to be sustainable economically as well. and we don't necessarily understand what it means and for a certain population. So they did that in the Save the World mode, where you can see what's in the llama before you buy it, and that's countering the impact of you don't know. It's not variable anymore, because now you can see what you're gonna get. Also, with Fortnite going more into season passes, this is more transparent, because you're gonna get whatever you're gonna get for that season, and you know when you're gonna buy. So it's not acting on that variable ratio reinforcement schedule. Right. It can play on the fear of missing out, but that's another problem. But it's way more transparent.
Eddie, I read something that you had either been interviewed about or wrote about this topic, which had to do with pay to win, and that doesn't go over well with the gamers themselves. That you shouldn't have a dynamic in your game where simply because someone has unlimited resources to throw into the game, they can buy their way into ultimate success, because everyone gets bitter about that.
Yes, in the West. More precisely, yes. It's not going well. It's also about fairness and about a culture. And in a culture, we have that if you work hard to get something, you should get it. It's not fair that if you just pay for it, you get it. So it's a problem that we see in society, but it's also a problem that you see in games. Whenever people see that it's unfair, it's actually doing a huge backlash. So whenever it's perceived as pay to win, meaning that if you buy a lot of loot boxes, or if you can put a lot of money in the game, then you're going to have better weapons or better abilities that are going to make you more awesome than other players, then it's seen as very unfair, and there's a huge backlash, and usually it's not going well. That's the reason why in most free-to-play games in the West, you only buy cosmetics, or you can only get stuff that's not impacting the gameplay. It's just impacting your how you look like in the game, or the dance moves that you have. It's not impacting the weapons or the abilities that you can get in the game.
So in the East, it's culturally okay, and they have no problem with pay to win?
It seems that it's more culturally accepted for now. We'll see how it evolves.
Interesting. All right. Well, I wanted to conclude our discussion today looking ahead a bit at where video game technology, will go in the near term and the long term. Of course, virtual reality is already here, and people do play VR games right now, but it has a long way to go. And certainly in the next several years, we'll see it make leaps and bounds. And ultimately, I mean, if you trust our television programming, everything from Star Trek to the Orville has some sort of completely immersive holodeck virtual reality experience where folks go in to rest, recreate, and experience a game-like scenario. And I'm just wondering, as things get more and more immersive, how you think the role of scientifically engineering the user's experience needs to evolve.
Yeah. So it's actually not that different. It's going to be the same ingredients that I've been talking about that are going to be we have to take into account. The big difference, especially with VR, it's not that you're necessarily more immersed. I mean, it feels more immersed because we remove the distraction from the environment. So you don't hear your phone ringing, or you don't see like something happening from the window. So you have less distractions, which helping you focus more on what's happening in the game. But again, if you're very if you're super into a game and you're concentrating in the game, you have that flow. So even if it's a phone game or a console game, you can still feel that immersion. But anyway, what's very different in VR games, it's more about the ingredients itself. Sometimes they're more challenging to balance. For example, if you in a game you need to guide players and you also need to remember to alleviate their memory load. The way we do that in many games is we put information in the HUD. So the HUD is the heads-up display. It's all the little icons that you have, your health bar, and a bunch of information that's always on screen. And this is actually helping you being immersed, because you don't have to remember what's happening, and you don't have to pause and get outside of the game to try to remember how to do this and that. In a VR game, you can't really have a HUD, a heads-up display, because then you have an overlay that's static, and then you have the environment that's moving sometimes quite a bit, and that's making people sick. So in VR, we have a lot of problems with simulation sickness, which also has to do with the brain limitations, and actually it's because of the mismatch between what we see and what your inner ear is feeling, and your proprioception is another sense, that the sense of your body in space. There's a mismatch. So this is when you can get that nausea feeling. And because of that, there's a lot of things that we use in traditional games that we can't use in VR. In VR, you're going to have to use signs and icons and elements to guide players in a more what we call diegetic way. So it's diegetic when it's part of the environment that the avatar in the game is actually seeing. So the HUD is not seen by the avatar in the world. It's only seen by the player outside of the gaming world. When it's diegetic, it's seen by the avatar itself. And it's more complicated to make clear, because if it's part of the world, players can turn around and maybe not see it. So it's the same problematics. We need to make sure that people perceive well, that they can memorize what they have to do, and they can pay attention to the elements that are important in the game. The problem is that the means that we have to ensure that this is happening are way more limited and constrained in VR. So that's the main difference. In AR, the big challenge is multitasking, especially if you have to move around to play the game. That's, to me, a huge limitation and a huge problem. It can actually be a security problem when you have people having accidents because they're looking at their phone and they don't see that they're going to fall because there's the hole or something in the ground. So that's the biggest.
That was a fun time with Pokemon Go when people were crossing the street playing the game, and
but it's a great game. It's very engaging and it's very fun, and it's make people go out and play together. So that's the great aspect of it. But the main limitation is when you're looking at your phone, and people know that when they're trying to walk in the street and look at their phone or reading a paper or whatever, we can bump into a lamppost because we're not good at multitasking. So that's the main problem with VR. Make sure that the elements from the real world is not going to distract players, and also that it's not going to be a security hazard if they have to play outside while moving. So it's the same ingredients, but there are different constraints and different. The challenge is sometimes harder to solve.
Right. Now, I told you at the top of the show before we started that although last year you could not tear my kids, well, you could, and we did, tear my kids and their friends away from Fortnite. They were so in love with it, but for them the game seems to have arced out, that they no longer are. They've sort of been there, done that with its battle royale format, and are onto other things. They had a great time, but it's not something that they're going to do, now and forever.
That's okay. That's okay.
Yes, exactly. And I'm sure there are others that, come into the game, and Fortnite certainly is not anything but a success story. But I just wonder if that sort of arc of the new thing that we're very compelled by, and then we've had our experience with it and move on, if that plays into what we've been discussing here as well.
Yes. So it's, when something is new and everybody's playing, you have to be part of the gang and be a part of it. So that's also the social pressure acting. But when you're in the game, and once you feel that you mastered everything in the game, there's nothing really new for you, you start getting bored. So that's the emotion part that is supporting motivation. In emotion, we need to have some variation. We need to have some surprises. We need to have something new, a twist or whatever. It can't be too new because then it can raise anxiety. But we love to have little surprises because if it's all the time the same and we feel that we master it, then there's no challenge anymore, and there's no real means of getting better, or you feel more competent at it. So there's when it starts stalling. This is when it starts getting boring. And this is why a lot of online games, when you call the games as a service, they have to renew the game very often, like every 72 hours, or every week, or every 2 weeks, or at least every month, that there's something new in the game, so that maybe people play a little bit and they play something else, but when there's a new thing, they come back to check it out. So that's also the reason why it's pretty draining for the teams to take care of online games, because not only you have to do long hours and crunch to ship a game because it's complicated, but once it's shipped, it's not done. It's only starting, and you have to always bring some new content and bring some surprises to keep, that attention going and to raise awareness. Because otherwise, it's just, it can slowly the engagement can go down. Now you have a few games that have been successful for several years. I look at World of Warcraft. There's been one for a long time. Or Minecraft, it's another example. Or GTA. These are games that were able to maintain engagement for a long time. We'll see what Fornite is, if it's going to be as successful. But it's hard. It's very hard to maintain engagement in such a long time.
It seems like it's good news for people who want to go into game design and game user experience, because, it's always changing and you want to always keep it new and fresh. And so it seems like there would be a lot of opportunity to.
And we need diversity.
Moving forward. Yeah,
it's good that we have way more success stories and more games, so we can have a lot of different flavors.
Celia Hodent, it has been so wonderful chatting with you today. We hope that folks will go out and explore deeper with the gamer's brain and really continue to get into the concepts we've been exploring here today. Celia, where have you landed post Epic Games? And is there anything that you would like to leave our listeners with here at the end of the show as we conclude?
So I've landed in California, back from, I miss California a lot when I left LucasArts. So now I'm back in California, but I'm traveling the world quite a bit. And now, because I'm spreading the UX love and I'm explaining all these elements to a lot of people in Europe, as far as Australia, in North America, in South America, and hopefully in Asia more. So I love meeting a lot of different people. And I love also working not only with what we call the AAA studios, so studios with big budgets, but also more indie developers, because they are the ones who don't necessarily have all the budget for taking care of UX and having that mindset. So I help them, I show them that it's actually, you can do a lot of things without having big budgets, and it's a good investment because it's going to be very good to do that early on instead of waiting for problems to happen once you ship the game. And more and more, I talk about bigger issues such as diversity and inclusion. So I apply the same principles in psychology, or the unconscious biases that we've been talking about, to help companies in the game industry and outside to hire more diverse people and make sure that they can do that. To do that, it's not only It's not good enough to just want to do it. You have to understand how these unconscious biases work, because it's preventing us from hiring more diverse people. So you have to design the environment. Same thing. You have to do that choice architecture to help that. So blind auditions, just like orchestras did, to make sure they hire more women. And I also talk a lot about dark patterns and ethics more and more. And I also help companies outside the game industry to, if they want to do gamification, understand what that means really, and not just focus on extrinsic rewards, but understand the whole complexity of making games. So all the stuff that I'm talking about in the book, that goes way beyond just adding badges to an activity. So I do a lot of stuff like that. So if you're interested to learn more about any of these things, don't hesitate to reach out to me, either from on my website or on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter.
That's wonderful. I just can't thank you enough for taking the time to sit down with us here today. It's been a great discussion. Flow the whole time, as far as I can tell. So I really appreciate it.
Try to eat my dog food, so that's good.
We record this show live every Friday at 11:30 Pacific Standard Time, 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you can watch live with us while we record the show at twit.tv/live. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the show at twit.tv/triangulation. We're so glad that all of you could join us here today, and we hope you'll come back for the next episode of Triangulation. Until then, take care.